cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Dr. Hughes. I'm Wayne Dennis. We haven't met.
No, good morning.
Good morning. You testified yesterday that you have to give careful attention to gendered stereotypes.
That is correct.
When you're talking about intimate partner violence, you have to pay attention to gendered stereotypes. And during your testimony, you in fact paid attention to gendered stereotypes, correct?
I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, you said we were going to have to pay attention to gendered stereotypes, and then you testified at length where you referenced both men and women. You paid attention to those stereotypes during the course of your testimony, correct?
What I was saying was you have to pay attention to gendered stereotypes when you're conducting these evaluations. You can't assume all the time that the male is the perpetrator and the female is the victim. You have to go into the evaluation understanding that the male also could be the victim of intimate partner violence.
In fact, you're aware that there are large-scale studies that do say that IPV towards males does exist.
Of course.
Okay. And every time you referred to the characteristic of a victim of intimate partner violence yesterday, you used the pronouns she or her, didn't you?
I was using the she and her pronouns in this case because my determination was, as I stated, that Ms. Heard was the victim of intimate partner violence. That is why I was using the she, her pronoun.
You, in fact, said women get into the relationship for all the right reasons. That's what you said. The woman gets into the relationship for all the right reasons. And then you say difficult for victim to extricate herself. Go on to say that she can and she should. Over and over, you use she, right?
I believe in this case I did because I was referencing this case where I found Ms. Heard to be the victim of intimate partner violence. It doesn't mean that men don't get into the relationships for all the right reasons too. I believe they do.
Nearly every time you reference the perpetrator of IPV, you use he or him, didn't you?
And it goes back to the same reasoning as I'm describing my understanding and my evaluation in this matter. Of course, men can be perpetrators and victims of intimate partner violence. That's well established in the research, and that's well established in my clinical practice as well.
Isn't the reason that you used the pronouns that you did that you almost always testify on behalf of a woman?
That's not correct.
You don't even remember the last time you testified on behalf of a man.
Well, I don't testify on behalf of someone. I testify as to the results of my evaluation. I frequently treat and assess male victims of childhood sexual abuse who are coming into treatment for abuse by their Boy Scout leader, by their coach, by their teacher, by a trusted adult. I see them in therapy. I see them in forensic matters, in criminal cases. So I treat and evaluate men all the time.
I didn't ask you about treatment. I asked you about testimony. You broke out your practice between treatment and testimony. I'm not asking you about treatment. When's the last time you testified on behalf of a man?
I testified recently in a deposition on behalf of a man who was traumatized because he was wrongly convicted.
At the time of your deposition 6 weeks ago, you couldn't remember a single time you had testified on behalf of a man.
I testified in my deposition that I testified in a case of a man who was wrongly convicted about 20 years and suffered physical and sexual violence in prison, and I detailed the traumatic effects of that happened on that gentleman.
All right. Why don't we take a look at your deposition?
Sure.
All right. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you.
All right. Transcript of the deposition that you gave March 28th, 2022, correct?
Yes.
All right. Let's go to page 77. a single instance where you were hired by the attorney representing the male in an IPV matter, correct?
In an IPV matter, not in a trauma matter or a child sexual abuse matter.
Okay, so that's the distinction. You don't have any recollection of ever testifying on behalf of a male in an IPV matter.
As I stated yesterday, the very first case that I testified in was in a same-sex intimate partner violence where the man was the victim of another man. I routinely treat and assess same-sex couples where then the female can be the perpetrator of another female and the male can be the perpetrator or a victim of his partner.
So, let me get this. You testified in a case where one male is alleged to have engaged in an IPV against another male.
Correct.
All right. Okay. But that's the only one you remember. That's the only one you remember.
No, I've done this frequently. As you well know, most cases don't go to trial. I've worked on hundreds and hundreds of cases. You've limited to testimony. Many cases don't come to trial, but I've issued reports and worked on many cases of same-sex intimate partner violence where men are the victims.
But I did ask you about testimony, and I limited the question to testimony. And the only testimony that you remember is the same-sex couple, right?
There were multiple same-sex couples, I believe, that I testified
That you testified in court at trial.
I believe so, yes.
All right, but you didn't remember that in March.
I did remember that in March.
Okay. You're a professional witness, correct?
That's not correct.
No? You make hundreds of thousands of dollars a year testifying in court, correct?
Not testifying in court. I conduct thorough, comprehensive psychological evaluations of individuals who are involved in a court case. The majority of those cases never show up in a courtroom. And half of my practice and half of my income is about my clinical work with people who are coming to me for therapy.
I didn't ask you about the other half of your income. I'm asking you whether you made hundreds of thousands of dollars a year testifying as an expert witness in court.
As you're phrasing that question, that's not correct. That would be the amount of income that I generate from my forensic practice. I testify perhaps maybe once or twice a year. Most of the work is done behind the scenes in evaluating individuals and issuing reports.
But you'll agree with me that a big part of that practice is providing expert witness testimony.
That's not correct.
No? That's not a big part of your practice.
If I testify twice a year, that's not a big part of my practice. All the other time is doing the work for the cases and evaluating the individuals and issuing reports.
What percentage of work do you devote to forensic psychology?
As I stated yesterday, I say half and half clinical, half forensic, but I also have a substantial amount of time that I use in the professional activities and serving on a professional board.
So, what portion of your practice do you provide expert witness services?
I think you're using the expert witness services synonymous with the forensic psychology part of the practice. So the forensic psychology practice, what I do here today is one part of it, and it's a smaller part as opposed to all of the evaluations and individuals that I'm assessing.
Your practice is successful enough that you maintain your offices on Madison Avenue in New York, correctly?
Correct. I've had that office since 2005.
Right. And you're sufficiently successful at your forensic work that you're able to perform unpaid work at a hospital, correct?
Correct, and I also do pro bono work as well.
There. In fact, you actually instruct others on the use of expert testimony in court cases, correct?
On the use and understanding trauma and violence abuse in the courtroom and how to, for advocates and people who could not have this level of training or experience, how to come into the courtroom and talk about very difficult issues of domestic violence. Yes.
All right. Can we pull up PX 1241? recognize that document?
Yes, it looks like the front page of a PowerPoint presentation.
And it's a PowerPoint presentation given by whom?
By myself and Mary Ann Dutton, who is a very well-known and respected researcher and clinician in the area of domestic violence.
And what's the topic of the PowerPoint that you're giving?
Expert witness testimony in cases involving domestic violence.
And who did you give this presentation to?
That was to the National Clearinghouse for the Defense of Battered Women. That is an organization that provides legal services to women who have assaulted or killed their partners in self-defense, and mostly people who these individuals, the women who they've seen in treatment, are through shelter-based programs or through advocates, and those are individuals who don't really know how to come into the courtroom and talk, and that's what this presentation and training was for.
I'm going to move PX 1241 into evidence.
Any objection? All right, 1241 in evidence. You want it published? Or?
Yes, let's publish it to the jury. Thank you.
Okay.
You want to know a terrible way to lose weight and get in shape? It's to give up all the foods that you actually enjoy and instead force yourself to eat nothing but chicken and broccoli and rice. No, but for real, do not do that. It's not sustainable at all. And giving up all the foods that you actually like is a recipe for disaster because it's just going to leave you craving junk food 24/7. And so a better way, and what I tell my clients to do, is to take a more sustainable approach.
For Test Boost Max, I noticed results within 5 days. I had more energy.
I can do it. A super lazy guy like me can do it. You can do it. I mean, at this point, a couple 100,000 guys have used Test Boost Max with pretty incredible results. And right now, I'm actually running a buy one, get one special on Test Boost Max for new customers. So anyone watching this can try it risk-free and get 3 free gifts as well. Now, normally this would be, I think it's $181 on our website, but it's free for anyone who tries Test Boost Max risk-free right now. But again, this is for a limited time only. So if you're interested, all you have to do is check it out at the link below right now.
Why I just get pissed out here when I see a simple who has 2,000 healthy calories to eat, and he's like, am I going to lose muscle? You don't have any muscle. I cut on like 1,700 calories and stay 230. I built my muscle over a decade plus. It ain't going nowhere. I've told my body to hang on to this muscle for a long period of time. You tell your body what to do. If you consistently use these muscle groups, it's not going to just eat them up for no reason. You're not going to go catabolic on muscles that you consistently use. People who think they lose muscle while cutting just found out the cold truth. You didn't have that much to begin with, homie. This is what long view is. This is what pain is. You're meant to experience pain every day. The pain of the world. You're supposed to feel it. If you don't feel pain, there's repercussions. It's called comfort and the that comes with it. Lack of confidence. Not feeling yourself. Not enjoying life. Overcompensating.
All right. Why don't we pull up PX 1242? You recognize this document?
Yes, this also looks like a PowerPoint presentation that I gave.
All right. What is the name of this PowerPoint presentation?
This is called The Use of Psychological Experts in Cases of Domestic Violence. It was presented to the Kings County Bar Association, which is in Brooklyn. And what this presentation talked about was some of the things that I talked to you all about yesterday, the myths and misconceptions in intimate partner violence, when women use force, what happens if they drop protective orders, how they present in court. And that's what this presentation was to attorneys at the Bar Association.
Okay. But this is another presentation that you gave as to the use of psychological experts, and you gave it to a bar association.
Right. They were prosecutors and defense attorneys in attendance at that bar association.
At your deposition, you testified that you were going to be paid $100 an hour for your time in this case.
That's an error in the transcript.
Oh, that's not right.
That's correct.
So, and you corrected the transcript?
We did not do an errata in the transcript at this point.
So you knew there was an error in the transcript, but you didn't fix it?
There were several errors in the transcript.
But you didn't fix any of them?
There was no time to fix them, that's correct.
All right. So you're not being paid $100 an hour. How much are you getting?
I'm being paid $500 an hour.
$500 an hour. And that's what, and that's the bill you sent for your deposition, right? $500 an hour.
Correct.
You submitted a number of disclosures in this case. You have not formed an opinion as to whether Mr. Depp committed intimate partner violence against Miss Heard, correct?
Correct. I formed the opinion that Ms. Heard's report of the intimate partner violence is consistent with what we know in the literature about intimate partner violence.
You have a limited role here, comparing individual data to group data, and then just determining whether it's consistent, right?
I wouldn't say it's a limited role, but that's generally correct.
You wouldn't use the word limited role?
A limited role in terms of how we go about a forensic evaluation. Not a limited role in this case.
Do you remember whether you used limited role in your deposition?
I don't. If you have it in front of me, you probably think I did, but yeah. Sure.
And you have no independent knowledge of the facts underlying the alleged abuse, correct?
I have the knowledge of the plethora of documents that I've reviewed in this case.
No, I'm asking you your independent first-hand knowledge. You have none of that, right?
You mean whether I was there?
Yeah, you weren't there.
Of course not.
Okay. And you're not testifying to the veracity, the truthfulness of any of the allegations.
Correct. I'm testifying to the consistency of the data points of all the different documents, including the psychological testing and the clinical evaluation that I conducted of Ms. Heard, and how that comports with the therapy records and all the other documents and the photos and text that I reviewed.
And you have no personal knowledge of any abuse?
Correct, personally. Correct.
Right. And all you know is what Ms. Heard self-reported to you and others?
That's not correct.
Because you did collateral interviews?
And I reviewed medical records, and I reviewed other witness statements of what they witnessed and what they saw.
And all of those statements that you reviewed, those were statements that started with Miss Heard, correct?
Not necessarily.
Well, the medical records did, didn't they?
Well, the medical records, if she's self-reporting what happened to her, sure. And that's what we do when we go to a physician. We say, I have a headache. We're self-reporting our difficulty.
Yeah. Everything Miss Heard reported directly to you was after she was sued by Mr. Depp in this case, correct?
Correct.
And you didn't meet Miss Heard until, what, September 2019?
That was the first evaluation appointment, correct.
How'd you get engaged?
Engaged?
How'd you get hired to do this work?
I was contacted by the legal team.
Or were you interviewed by her legal team as to whether you were going to testify here?
I was not.
You were not interviewed?
I was not.
You were contacted?
Correct.
And you worked with that legal team before?
I had.
Yeah. So they already knew who you were, right?
Correct.
Right. And at any time that you were working with Miss Heard or assessing Miss Heard, she could have chose to fire you, correct?
I suppose her legal team could have chose to fire her. I was not her. She is not my client. The legal team is the one who hires me. I am responsible to the legal team, not Miss Heard.
And this the legal team hired you, already knew who you were because you worked together previously.
And clearly they knew of my expertise in this area of intimate partner violence and traumatic stress, which is why they contacted me to work on this matter.
All right. Several times yesterday you used language about assessing Ms. Heard's relationship with Mr. Depp. You remember talking about that?
Sure.
You can't assess a relationship without talking to both parties, can you?
You certainly certainly can get a lot of information from one party, absolutely.
But
And
you're
especially when it's buttressed by other documents, including 4 years of therapy records and couples therapy records, you can get a lot of information based on those documents and that contemporaneous reports of the relationship.
Respectfully, I didn't ask whether you get a lot of information. I asked whether you can assess a relationship without talking to both parties.
I believe you can. There are certainly limitations inherent in that, but you certainly can.
You talked to Ms. Heard for, what, approximately 30 hours, right?
Correct.
How long did you spend with Mr. Depp?
I did not spend any time with Mr. Depp. It was my understanding that he did not sit for a psychological evaluation.
Right. In fact, you never met Mr. Depp, have you?
I have not.
But you report being able to assess the relationship between Mr. Depp and Ms. Heard?
But I also read Mr. Depp's transcripts of his testimony. I watched his deposition testimony. I reviewed his medical records. I reviewed his text messages. So it's not necessarily totally blind. I did have information, although I'm not making a conclusion about Mr. Depp himself.
Is the standard now not necessarily totally blind? That's how you assess the relationship? If it's not necessarily totally blind, I can assess it?
No, we assess as clinical psychologists relationships all the time. That's what we're trained to do. Certainly someone who's been trained in intimate partner violence to understand and look for the dynamics that happen in that relationship. And then when we have external data that supports what the individual is telling us, way before this legal case even came on the scene, that becomes very strong data to support that conclusion.
Let's talk about some of that data.
Sure.
All right? You chose to conduct some collateral interview.
Correct.
Right? And you interviewed Dr. Bonnie Jacob.
Correct.
And you looked at her notes.
Correct.
And you know that Ms. Jacobs, Dr. Jacobs, doesn't know anything about the version of what happened in Australia until Ms. Heard had already been sued. Correct?
I believe she was not in treatment with Dr. Jacobs at the time the Australia incident occurred. So that would be correct. She did reach out to Dr. Connell Cohen about Australia, who she was treating with at that time contemporaneously.
All right, I'll ask you about that. We'll get there. So, you know that Ms. Heard stopped seeing Dr. Jacobs in August 2014.
That's correct.
And she didn't go back until after she got sued, right?
I believe that's the date. I'd have to look to make sure, but I believe that you're correct.
And you said you reviewed you interviewed Dr. Connell.
That's correct.
And you also reviewed his deposition testimony.
That's correct.
And you know that he testified that when he was treating a patient, he assumes the patient is telling the truth, correct?
I believe he said something to that effect in his deposition.
And
if he has no reason to believe otherwise, if there's no other data to believe otherwise.
Introducing White Claw Surf. A whole new wave of White Claw.
I'll ask you about that. We'll get there. So, you know that Ms. Heard stopped seeing Dr. Jacobs in August 2014.
That's correct.
And she didn't go back until after she got sued, right?
I believe that's the date. I'd have to look to make sure, but I believe that you're correct.
And you said you reviewed you interviewed Dr. Connell.
That's correct.
And you also reviewed his deposition testimony.
That's correct.
And you know that he testified that when he was treating a patient, he assumes the patient is telling the truth, correct?
I believe he said something to that effect in his deposition.
And
if he has no reason to believe otherwise, if there's no other data to believe otherwise, that your patient's not being totally honest with you, then you believe what they're saying.
Right. No other data to believe otherwise, but the sole thing that's happening is Ms. Heard is talking to Mr. Cohen, or Dr. Cohen.
I wouldn't say she's talking to him. She's going to him for therapy, and he's using his clinical psychological expertise to understand the connection between her symptoms and what she's reporting, what's going on in her life.
All right. But you understand that he testified that he assumes the patient is telling the truth.
Again, I understand that statement in his testimony. I have a lot more rich information of having spoken to him for 2 hours and reviewing his clinical note.
Testified he was making a leap of faith with respect to that, right? With respect to the truthfulness.
Again, that was not my understanding of speaking with him and reviewing his notes. I'm aware he testified something to that effect.
And you testified yesterday that Dr. Cohen never diagnosed Ms. Heard with any personality disorders. You remember that?
Yes.
In fact, Dr. Cohen's deposition testimony reflects the fact that he doesn't make diagnoses, correct?
Correct, and I asked him specifically, did he have any indications that even if he doesn't, as his practice, use them, does she meet criteria for a personality disorder? And he told me she did not.
All right, so you asked him specifically with respect to a topic you haven't disclosed in your expert report, and then he made a conclusion that's reflected in no document.
It's reflected in my notes. It's reflected in his notes about what he's treating. He's treating the symptoms. He's not focusing on the diagnosis, but he is treating the symptoms.
You talked about Dr. Cohen's concern for Ms. Heard's safety.
Correct.
He wasn't talking about her physical safety, was he?
Yes, he was.
No, he was talking about her emotional safety. Wasn't that what he was talking about?
He was concerned for both.
Okay. Did Dr. Cohen testify that he never had the feeling that Johnny intended to hurt Ms. Heard?
I believe he said that. I mean, he talked about Mr. Depp being very poorly controlled, and that's what made him, Dr. Cohen, concerned, because in those moments when he was not controlled, that he could accidentally seriously hurt Ms. Heard.
Let's do this again. Ms. Heard told Dr. Cohen that Mr. Depp was poorly controlled, correct?
That's not correct.
Okay. He determined that from the treatment he was providing Ms. Heard.
And he also had a couple session with Mr. Depp, and he also had correspondence with Dr. Kipper. So he had other information as to Mr. Depp's functioning.
All right, you talked about Dr. Banks.
Correct.
Dr. Banks was doing relationship consulting, right? Consultation and relation.
Correct.
And Dr. Banks only met with them once.
Correct.
All right. And you did an interview, I think, with Ms. Heard's mother, Peggy.
That's correct.
All right. You'd agree with me that a person's family member is not the most objective source of information?
Sometimes you have to certainly control for that the person may be wanting to be protective of their daughter, of course.
And you interviewed Ms. Paige Heard after Mr. Depp had already sued Amber Heard.
Right. The entirety of my work in this case happened, obviously, after the lawsuit.
Did you review, in that context, any of Paige Heard's text messages with Mr. Depp?
I'm not sure if I saw them with Mr. Depp. I do believe I saw some with Miss Heard. I mean, Miss Paige Heard, Amber Heard's mother, did talk to me about her relationship with Mr. Depp.
And she told you that she loved Johnny even after Amber alleged abuse, correct?
She did.
All right. Now, you testified that you approach a forensic evaluation with, I think you said it again today, a healthy degree of skepticism.
Correct.
All right. This skepticism didn't cause you to conduct interviews with, for instance, Laurel Anderson.
Right, I did not speak to Dr. Laurel Anderson.
And you chose not to speak to Dr. Laurel Anderson because you disagreed with Dr. Laurel Anderson?
That's not correct.
All right. What did Dr. Laurel Anderson do on behalf of Ms. Heard and Mr. Depp?
She was a couples therapist that they sought. They had 4 couples sessions. as I stated yesterday, one of them in which Mr. Depp stormed out of. She did have a long, I guess, evaluation or interview with Mr. Depp individually and with Ms. Heard individually. And then she saw them intermittently after the May 21st, 2016 incident, and when they were filing for divorce.
So you didn't interview Laurel Anderson, but you know what she did? How'd you figure that out?
Because we had her redacted notes and her deposition.
All right. And you understood from her deposition that Dr. Anderson didn't believe Ms. Heard to be a victim of spousal abuse?
I believe those were her words, yes.
And you also understood from her deposition that Mr. Depp had not had a very long history of being violent with any of his wife or women.
That she said that as well.
Yeah.
But that's something about Ms. Heard that significantly triggered him. She talked about that as well.
And Dr. Anderson thought that Mr. Depp had been, her words, well controlled, I think for almost 20 or 30 years, correct?
Up until this point, I believe she said.
I know that you testified that you reviewed medical records.
Yes.
Hearts UltraGuard Pro Max Flea and Tick Collar. A soft, comfy fit collar with a secure buckle. Comfort they can enjoy. Protection you can trust. Hearts UltraGuard Pro Max. 6 months of full body flea and tick protection.
So, you know Miss Heard had a personal nurse.
Correct.
Erin Filati.
Correct.
You didn't interview Miss Filati either.
I did not.
You know she spent time with Miss Heard on a regular basis during her relationship with Mr. Depp.
Correct. I had her clinical notes that I reviewed.
Right. And you reviewed her deposition testimony.
Correct.
Some of which the jury's heard, right?
I believe so.
Yeah. And you reviewed the nursing notes.
Yes.
So you know that Ms. Heard admitted to a history of eating disorders to Ms. Filati, correct?
I know that's in the notes. That's nowhere else in any other record, so I'm not sure where that came from.
But you relied on everybody else's notes.
And there are some things that I disagreed with, like I disagree with Dr. Laurel Anderson about it being mutual abuse.
Right. So the stuff you disagree with, you disregard, and the rest you keep, correct?
That's not correct.
But that's what you did.
That's not correct.
All right. You know that Ms. Filati saw Ms. Heard immediately after she returned from Australia.
I'd have to look at the notes again to be sure, but I know she did see her when she came back from Australia. That's correct.
Did Ms. Filati document any injuries to Ms. Heard in her notes?
I did not see that in the record.
Okay, so you looked at her notes, and there's no injury to Ms. Heard documented in her nurse's notes following her return from Australia.
Correct.
Okay. You talked about this concept, which you then defined, lethality. And you testified there are certain factors of their present relationship where a woman ends up murdered by her partner.
Correct.
And that's one of the ways you look as to whether a woman is in a very dangerous situation.
Correct.
Can we pull up PX92?
It's
Yeah,
evidence.
published to the jury.
Yeah, it will be published.
Do you know what this is?
I believe this is the knife that Miss Heard gave to Mr. Depp as a gift.
All right. And you speak Spanish?
Un poquito?
You know what it says?
Yes, it says hasta la muerta, till death.
So, a woman you suggest has characteristics of being afraid for her life gives her intimate partner a large knife, which she has inscribed demonstrate jealousy with Ms. Heard. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
And you specifically talked about Mr. Depp displaying jealousy regarding the actor James Franco.
Correct.
Yeah. Now, the very first time you met with Ms. Heard, she talked to you about Ms. Franco, Mr. Franco, James Franco, correct?
I don't know if it was the first time, but I did ask about some other relationships.
Okay, so why don't we do this? Let's go PX 1246. I just want to go to the first page. All right. So, do you recognize the document that's in front of you?
Yes.
All right. And what I would like to do, what is it?
It's a top sheet of a background information questionnaire that I use to help guide the evaluation.
Okay. So, now, this is, who filled it out?
I filled it out.
Whose form is it?
My form.
All right. I'm going to move just the first page into evidence because we're going to talk about other portions of it later.
Could you back us so she can see the whole first page? Any objection? Okay, I can't.
We will admit the whole thing in evidence.
You want the whole thing in evidence?
Sure.
I have no objection whatsoever.
All right, 1246 in evidence in full. Okay. Are there any identifiers that need, or we're just going?
Yeah, I'm sure there's going to be.
All right.
Probably.
Okay, so you owe me a redacted one, correct?
Don't know what the nature of the redactions are going to be, but
Okay, well, you
Yeah.
can discuss it.
We'll work with
Okay,
them on
thank
that,
you.
but I'm
All right.
positive there's identified.
all right. 1246 has been moved into evidence. Can we blow up the bottom right-hand corner?
All right, you want to publish to the jury?
Yeah, let's publish it to the jury. I don't.
Well, we can, why don't you,
I don't see anything on the first
if
page.
you want to look at that, any objection to that? Well, that's what they're going to show.
That's what we're going to show.
All right, publish then.
All right. So this is the bottom corner. Your notes, and it's under the section of your notes that's entitled "Intimate Relationship."
Correct.
Right. And one of the notes here on the right, it says JF. That's James Franco, right?
Correct.
Got close, but really wanted to be with Johnny.
Well, it says you have friends. They were friends.
All right. Said friends, but you put him under intimate relation.
Well, there's a line there because I was asking specifically about other things that were allegations in this matter.
There's a line there because you did not believe that they should go under intimate relationships, but it's on your form?
She wasn't telling me that this was an intimate relationship. I queried as to what's going on with James Franco because that was something that was raised in this case.
And there's a note for December 2015.
When they became more friends, more friendly.
Right. And that was a period of time in which Ms. Heard was married to Mr. Depp, correct?
Correct.
So she became close with Mr. Franco in December 2015, and at least you put it under intimate relationship.
With a line differentiating another part of this document.
Okay. Did you provide another header? Like a header that says friends?
No.
No. Let's look at the next one. The next one says, I think it says Elon.
Correct.
It's Elon Musk, right?
Correct.
All right. May 2016.
Correct.
Met Ball.
Correct.
That's a big fancy party in New York, right?
Yes, it is.
All right. And she says she dated him after Johnny.
Correct.
She met Elon Musk in May 2016. When did she file the TRO?
The last answer was May 21st. I believe it was May 26th, 27th.
did she start dating Elon Musk?
Sometime after that.
Sometime after the TRO?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. You talk, we can take that down. You talked quite a lot yesterday about this concept of reactive file.
Yes.
Yeah. So just so I understand your position on this, is it your position that if Miss Heard was abused, she gets to hit Mr. Depp?
That's not my opinion.
But you know she hits him, right?
And I testified to that.
Right. And how many times do you believe that she told you that she hit him?
Do I believe that she told me, or how many instances were there?
Well, I don't know. How would you know other than her telling you? You weren't there, right?
I was not there, that's correct.
All right. How many...
Daddy, I'm worried. Everyone says the virus is bad. I don't want to get sick. Did you get the shot?
Unvaccinated people are 29 times more likely to be hospitalized with COVID-19. Be a hero. Get the shot.
All right. Yes. All right, we ready for the jury? Okay. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. All right, be seated. All right, the plaintiff has rested in the defense case. Your witness,
Your Honor, I'd like to call Dr. Don Hughes to the stand.
Dr. Hughes.
You shall be swear or affirm to testify truthfully in this case or penalty of law.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you, Your Honor. Will you please state your name?
Dawn Hughes.
And what is your profession?
I am a clinical and forensic psychologist.
And where is your practice located?
I practice in New York City.
What is a clinical psychologist?
Sure. So a clinical psychologist is somebody who assesses, evaluates, and treats individuals who are suffering from a variety of ailments or problems that they have in their lives. It could be a major psychiatric disorder, and it could be problems in living. Clinical psychologists also participate in training, in education, and in research ventures.
And what is a forensic psychologist?
So a forensic psychologist is someone who applies the science and principles of clinical psychologists to a particular legal question at hand.
And please describe your background in terms of your education for us.
So I received my bachelor degree in psychology from Hamilton College, which is in upstate New York. I then received my master's degree and my PhD from Nova Southeastern University, which is in Florida. I then had to complete my year-long internship, and that was at Yale University in the School of Medicine in the Department of Psychiatry. And there I did 2 full-year rotations. I did a year rotation in the Substance Abuse Treatment Unit and another year rotation in the West Haven Mental Health Clinic, where we saw individuals suffering from a wide array of difficulties and psychiatric illnesses. After that, I had to complete my postdoctoral fellowship, which is another year that's required in order to get licensed, and that was back in New York at Cornell Medical College in the Anxiety and Traumatic Stress program there.
Please describe your training and experience in psychology and trauma.
So my experience in trauma has been predominantly throughout graduate school. I started at a domestic violence program that was housed within our community mental health center of the university. And that program, we saw both men and women who were coming through the program. The majority of the men were court-ordered for batterers intervention programs to participate in mostly group therapy because of their behavior in intimate partner violence, domestic violence. We also treated the female victims who were victims of intimate partner violence in mostly in individual therapy, but we did run some groups there as well. After that practicum experience, I went to work at the Veterans Administration in their outpatient psychiatry clinic. And in that clinic, I treated mostly, this was Florida, so they're much older adults. So we saw a lot of Vietnam-era veterans and actually World War II veterans in that program, and a few of veterans who served combat in the first Iraq War. Sort of overlapping in that time, I also was the research coordinator for the Child Sex Abuse Survivors Program, and that was also a treatment program that was housed within that same community mental health center. And we saw individuals, both men and women, who were coming for treatment to deal with the consequences, the psychological after effects of having been sexually abused as a child. After that, I completed my internship when I was at Yale at the substance abuse program because we know there's a high concordance, a high rate of trauma-based disorders with substance abuse. I put together a group, a women's group of female heroin addicts, recovering heroin addicts who also had either domestic violence or childhood abuse histories. So we did a dual substance abuse harm reduction model with the healing from the traumatic effects of the violence that they experienced. On my postdoctoral fellowship, I was in the Anxiety and Traumatic Stress program. As the name sounds, we saw individuals who were suffering from trauma-based disorders and anxiety, mostly late adolescents and adults, men and women, from rape, sexual assault, violence. Some were simple assaults on the streets, being mugged, and things of that nature. I also did teaching and training for Victim Services, which is New York City's largest victim-based organization who runs a lot of services for victims of domestic violence and shelter-based programs. And I did some education and training for them and teaching for a number of years.
Thank you. Let's talk about your current occupation. What positions do you currently hold?
So I currently have a private practice in Manhattan, and I also have a faculty position at Weill Cornell Medical College. I'm a clinical assistant professor of psychology in the Department of Psychiatry there. This is what we call on the voluntary faculty, which means you don't get paid, but you participate in bringing in the interns, selecting the interns for that year. In that program, I teach, I think for the past 7-8 years, the ethics seminar to the interns, and also participate in other didactics that they have. I'm also called upon to sort of troubleshoot difficult scenarios that clinicians, either trainees or full clinicians, might have If there's an issue of intimate partner violence or child sex abuse and they don't really know sort of what to do in that situation, I get consulted to do that. And then most recently, I was part of our program's COVID response team, where in pretty much March, April, May, June, July 2020, where New York City was the epicenter, we sort of mobilized and were really doing psychological first aid and helping our hospital-based workers deal with the stress and the trauma from seeing so much death and destruction because of COVID in those first months of New York City's COVID wave.
What does your independent practice entail?
So my independent practice is predominantly, I say three things. The bulk is I see individuals in therapy, 2.5 days. I see people who come to my office who are mostly dealing from, the traumatic effects of victimization, childhood abuse, rape, sexual assault, sexual harassment, domestic violence. And I see these individuals in therapy. I do have a percentage of individuals who do not have a trauma history, and that's usually the anxiety disorders that I see. They may have panic disorder or generalized anxiety disorder or other difficulties and just relational difficulties or problems in living. The second big part of what I do is this, forensic psychology, like I am doing here today. I evaluate individuals who were involved in legal matters. I consult with prosecutors and district attorneys and U.S. attorneys on their cases, and just something that has to do with the legal system. And then the other smaller percentage is the engagement in professional activities in the profession.
Do you have any areas that you specialize in?
Yes, I specialize in interpersonal violence and traumatic stress.
And what is interpersonal violence?
So interpersonal violence is the umbrella term for when one person does something violent or abusive toward another. And that includes domestic violence, childhood sexual abuse, rape, sexual assault, sexual harassment, physical assault. All of those type of behaviors we understand as interpersonal violence. And then the traumatic stress is the consequence of that. What happens to individuals when they experience these sort of life-altering events, these really adverse life events? Traumatic stress is one of the outgrowths and the psychological consequences that people have when they've been exposed to these type of traumas.
So intimate partner violence, rape, and sexual assault are major areas of your focus of practice?
That's correct.
Fair to say?
Objection leading.
I'll sustain the objection.
Okay. I'll just move on. What types of patients do you treat in your private office?
So I treat adults mostly, men and women in my practice. I sometimes will treat late adolescents, 17 or 18. They'll come to me usually after a rape or sexual assault, and I'll treat them in short-term treatment. But mostly adults who are, have sustained some kind of traumatic event in their lives.
Approximately how many victims of interpersonal violence have you examined or personally interviewed over the course of your career?
Hundreds upon hundreds.
And how many years have you been practicing?
Well, I started practicing in graduate school in 1992, and I was licensed in 1996, so 25, 30 years.
Okay. Are you board certified?
Yes, I am.
Please describe to the jury what board certification means and what you are certified in.
Board certification is the highest degree of postdoctoral certification that a psychologist can obtain. And I am board certified in forensic psychology, and that means that I have just amassed a competency in the area of forensic psychology.
And are you licensed to practice psychology?
Yes, I am.
And in how many states are you licensed?
I'm licensed in 3 states, in New York, North Carolina, and Connecticut, and then I have some temporary licenses in other states as well.
Have you published in the area of your specialization?
I have. I am not predominantly a researcher or somebody who writes. I'm a clinician. I'm doing direct clinical service, but over the course of my graduate school and postdoctoral time, I have published some things, yes.
And have you published a book chapter relating to rape and sexual assault?
Objection leading.
Overruled.
Yes, I have. Rape and sexual assault in adult women.
And have you published any book chapters relating to structured or clinical assessment of risk or violence?
Yes, I co-authored a book chapter entitled Structured Clinical Assessment of Risk and Violence.
Okay. Have you given any other trainings or presentations to mental health professionals in the area of trauma and abuse?
Yes, I've given many trainings at national conferences, at legal conferences for attorneys, for mental health professionals on understanding trauma and how trauma may show up in the courtroom, on understanding what a victim of intimate partner violence might look like, of understanding the difficulties that a rape victim might have to come into court to testify. And training just regular sort of mental health professionals on how to understand trauma, how to look for trauma, what does it look like when it comes into your office, how do you treat it, how do you assess it, all of those factors I've done a number of trainings on.
Have you been invited on any occasions to train attorneys and judges on trauma and violence?
Yes, I have. I was invited by the Judicial Conference to be part of the training curriculum to train our New York State Supreme Court justices on issues of intimate partner violence and traumatic stress. Some of the things that I've just been talking to you here about how to understand what happens in those situations, how to understand the myths and misconceptions that may abound in these situations, and how you can sort of more accurately understand what a victim is talking to you about and telling you when they come into your courtroom.
Have you given any presentations to judicial symposiums on domestic violence?
Yes, I've also been contacted by, sometimes judges will have symposiums in their courtroom. They will make a decision to hold a particular symposium on particular topics, and I was asked to come to presentations for judges on numerous occasions.
And what, if any, presentations did you do on understanding women's use of force in IPV?
That was a recent presentation. I think that was invited by one of the judges of the Office on Domestic Violence in New York. And the title is When Women Use Force in Situations of Intimate Partner Violence. And my topic was to talk about the complexities of that issue and what does that look like and how can we differentiate if both people are fighting. How do we know that this is intimate partner violence? So what does the research tell us about that? How do we understand that, and how can we really accurately assess that? And that was sort of the bulk of what that training was about.
What professional organizations do you belong to?
I belong to a number. I belong to the American Psychological Association, which is the largest body of psychologists in the United States, over here, headquarters in D.C. Because it's so big, there are subdivisions of American Psychological Association, so I belong to the Division of Trauma Psychology. I belong to the Division of Psychology and the Law, the Division of Psychologists in Private Practice. I belong to other organizations, the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies, which, as the name says, it's an international society where we are interdisciplinary, mostly psychiatry and psychology, researchers and clinicians, to really understand and further our awareness about trauma and traumatic stress. I belong to the International Society for Trauma and Dissociation. I belong to the Anxiety Disorders of Association of America. I'm a fellow in the American Board of Forensic Psychology. I don't know if I'm forgetting any.
Okay. Are any of these specific to interpersonal violence or trauma?
Well, clearly the Trauma Division of the American Psychological Association, the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies, and the International Society for Trauma and Dissociation, and then also the Anxiety Disorders of Association continues to talk about trauma, because prior to this new DSM-5, PTSD was originally categorized under the anxiety disorders. So there are still colleagues and researchers in the anxiety disorders organizations who talk about PTSD and trauma.
Do you hold any leadership roles in these organizations?
Yes, I am currently the president-elect of the Trauma Division of the American Psychological Association. That is an elected position. You have to be elected by our membership. And now I serve as with the presidential trio. So there's three of us. You serve with the immediate past president, the current president, and the elect, so it's a 3-year term. And what we try to do is continue to disseminate best practices in trauma psychology and also interface with the larger American Psychological Association organization to continue to disseminate best practices and have just a voice for trauma psychology with our larger body and policy making. I've been involved in the Trauma Psychology Executive Board since its inception. I was a founding member of that division. I served as a membership chair, a program chair, an awards chair. I was the APA Council of Representatives, which means I was also elected to serve a 3-year term and sit on the governance board of APA, representing the Division of Trauma Psychology. So I've been very actively involved in the trauma division.
And what is the Division of Trauma Psychology?
So the Division of Trauma Psychology are psychologists who come together, who want to disseminate best practices in trauma psychology. We want to make sure that we have our finger on the pulse of research and evidence-based interventions for people who are struggling with traumatic events that have happened to them.
Okay. Have you served in leadership positions of other professional organizations?
Yes, I was. There's a New York City-based organization. It's called the Women's Mental Health Consortium, and that's also an interdisciplinary organization. It's psychology, psychiatry, nursing, social work, and this was formed in order to give women sort of a referral base and more information about mostly like reproductive psychiatry. We know that certain difficulties and psychological difficulties that you have can erupt when you're pregnant or postpartum. So we wanted to have a number of resources available to women in the New York City area. I was a membership chair there for a number of years, and then I was the president of that organization, I think 2009 to 2017. I don't have my CV, but I think that's about right.
Why is participation in professional organizations important in your field?
Well, it's important to me because I do believe very much in service. I do believe very much in giving back. I do believe that it's important as a psychologist who believes strongly in trauma psychology and helping people that I can be part of a voice at the table, part of that push to get policy and understanding, especially with the insurance companies, to make sure that people are getting, the appropriate care that they deserve. So it's something that just has always been part of my life in varying degrees. And as a psychologist, I feel like it's a very rewarding part of my job.
Do you attend professional conferences?
Yes, I do. Typically multiple times a year. Of course, COVID threw a little bit of a wrench in that since some things are virtual. But yes, I routinely attend conferences.
And why do you think that's important?
It's important to stay abreast of developments in the field. It's important to meet with your colleagues across the country and see what they're doing and what they're hearing and what's working and what's not working. So when you're at a conference and somebody's presenting new or novel research, then you can take that information and bring that back to your clients and bring that back to my forensic work. So it absolutely enhances the work that I do.
Have you ever been qualified to testify in the field of psychology as an expert witness?
Yes, I have.
How many times?
I was first qualified in 1998, so since then, about 50 times.
Okay. And how often in that 50 times has the specialty been in interpersonal violence and traumatic stress?
Probably more than half.
Okay. Have you ever worked for or testified for the prosecution in criminal matters, like the District Attorney's Office, U.S. Attorney's Office?
Yes, I have, frequently.
Do you testify for both sides in lawsuits, plaintiffs and defendants?
Yes, I do.
Have you ever worked on other cases that didn't go to trial?
Many.
Okay. Have you ever found an individual that you evaluated did not suffer from the effects of interpersonal violence or PTSD?
Frequently.
Okay. Have you ever not been qualified in court where you have been proffered to qualify as an expert in the court?
No.
Your Honor, I would at this time move to qualify Dr. Hughes as an expert in forensic psychology with a specialization in interpersonal violence and traumatic stress.
All right, any objection?
No objection to qualifying her as an expert in forensic psychology.
All right. more specifically, forensic psychology with a specialization in interpersonal violence and traumatic stress.
Any objection?
No.
All right, so moved.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Hughes, please tell the jury what domestic violence, intimate partner violence means.
Sure. So I'm probably going to be interchanging the language, domestic violence and interpersonal violence, and for purposes here, these are the same thing. So intimate partner violence is a pattern of manipulation, fear, and coercive control that happens within an intimate relationship. It constitutes using a variety of abusive behaviors, and that can be physical violence, sexual violence, psychological aggression, emotional abuse, stalking or surveillance behaviors, and economic abuse. The abusive behaviors occur over time, not all at once, and they're also interspersed with very normal times, times without violence, times with love and happiness, and it's this interpositioning of the violence with the love and the abuse, with the love and the care, that makes it very difficult for a victim to extricate herself from that situation and from that relationship.
And what would you say is the overarching dynamic of these relationships?
So the overarching dynamic is the abuse of power and control of one person wanting to have dominance in that relationship, say over most things that the couple or that the victim does or does not do.
Please tell the jury what coercive control means.
So coercive control is a tactic of victimization. The goal of it is to establish dominance. What coercive control does is that it imposes negative consequences for noncompliance with your partner's expectations or demands. And what that does is it erodes away at the victim's autonomy and her independence.
What is physical violence?
So physical violence is when one person uses their body against the body of another with the intent to cause injury or harm. That can be push, shove, slap, kick, punch, beat up, meaning multiple types of physicality in one instance, throw, slam into a wall, push into something hard that you could hurt yourself. Clearly, use of a weapon would be a physically violent act as well.
Does size and strength matter between the parties?
Yes, very much so. This is very well documented in the literature about violence and abuse in relationships, and that's just physics. That's just proportional force. That if a 185-pound man is going to push a 120-pound woman, that's going to feel quite different than a 120-pound woman pushing a 185-pound man. And it's just about proportional force and the size and strength differential. And that is why specifically, if you look at wrestling or boxing, they match weight classes. And they do that for a reason, because they know that it's not fair if somebody is bigger and stronger than the other. So it's certainly not the only factor, but it is a factor that one has to consider if a relationship is violent.
What is psychological aggression?
So psychological aggression is threats and the imposition of threats with the intent to control someone's behavior. So it's doing a threat so that you will modify your behavior and do what your partner wants. Some psychological aggression techniques are intimidation, slamming your hand on a table, punching a wall, throwing something, mumbling under your mouth, cursing, screaming, sort of these high emotional balance type of activities that can cause a victim to feel afraid and feel intimidated. And then if there has been an act of physical violence where that contingency has already been established, that this person, your partner, has said, okay, I not only have the ability to use violence against you, I also have the willingness to do it. The intimidating tactics take on greater flavor. They take on greater salience. They mean more because you know what could be coming down the pike.
What is emotional abuse?
So emotional abuse functions to denigrate a person's sense of self-worth and their self-perception. It's about name-calling, being very mean-spirited, putting yourself down, using gender-based language that's offensive, racial slurs, all types of behaviors to really make a person feel less than they actually should.
And what is sexual abuse?
So sexual abuse in an intimate relationship functions to establish dominance and establish power. What it is simply in the psychological and psychiatric communities is forcing someone to do something sexual against your will when you did not want to. It can be forced sex, either forced vaginal, oral, anal sex, and be forced to engage in any other type of sexual act that you may not want to do. And when I say force, it doesn't mean it has to have physical force. There's a lot of psychologically coercive tactics that are used that many times when violence has already been established in the relationship, the victim often feels that she can't say no for fear of reprisal, for fear of retaliation, for saying no to those acts. So sexual abuse, does happen in intimate partner relationships. A lot of people don't want to talk about it, and they don't want to ask about it because it makes people very uncomfortable.
Is digital penetration of the vagina sexual abuse?
Some leading.
What, if any, role does digital penetration of the vagina play in sexual abuse?
If it is non-consensual, then it is abusive.
What, if any, penetration of inanimate objects into the vagina plays a role in sexual abuse?
Again, the operative word is consensual. If you are not consenting to those acts, then it is sexually abusive.
Is there a distinction between sexual violence and sexual abuse?
Not really. Sexual violence is a term of art. It is the overarching umbrella that we in the psychological and psychiatric communities talk about. So if we are looking at our diagnostic and statistical manual and say what are the traumas that could cause PTSD, it's listed as sexual violence. So it's an umbrella term that allows us to understand it could be childhood sexual abuse, it could be a rape, a sexual assault, it can be sexual abuse in an intimate relationship. So it's really just an overarching term that we use in the field.
What are
I'm sorry. So it doesn't mean, I think people often mistake it to mean that when you are being sexually abused, that someone's punching you or someone's hitting you or someone's doing something like that because you hear the violence. It does not mean that. That could happen, but that term does not require that, nor does it mean that.
What are stalking or surveillance behaviors?
So stalking and surveillance behaviors are a common tactic of typically men who use violent behaviors in an intimate relationship. What they do is they allow the woman to know that wherever she is, wherever she goes, he's going to know. I'm going to maybe look at your phone, see who you're talking to, track you on Find My iPhone, look at your Instagram, look at your emails, really having a way of knowing all of the personal information about you. And what that does, it again erodes the victim's autonomy and it erodes her sense of privacy. She doesn't feel that wherever she can go, that somewhere he's not going to be part of her life in a very objectionable way. Sometimes there's the pop-ins. They'll show up at places that they're not supposed to be and that we don't want them to be, just as a way of checking. Sometimes they'll have friends or family check up on their partners to make sure where they are. What time did you get home? But you didn't turn off your phone at this time, but you came in the door this time. Like all of the sort of constant questioning and interrogation about an individual's whereabouts.
What about economic abuse? What is that?
So economic abuse is a way to, again, continue to maintain control over your intimate partner. Sometimes it's withholding information about the finances, of not letting you have access to the finances. If you can't have access to a credit card or a checking account or, Apple Pay on your phone, then you're rendered usually much more economically dependent on your partner, and that limits tangible options for you. For individuals where that sort of tangible options isn't there, we see the economic abuse or the economic restriction when one partner refuses to share any information about the funds. So it's not like I can't go shopping because I won't have money, but I don't have any decision making in our family money. I don't have any idea of what we're doing in our family vis-a-vis our finances. So it's a way of definitely keeping that very separate and not in a consensual. Some couples make that choice. One person does all the money, that's fine. But when it doesn't come from a place of of consensual choice making, it can be abusive.
So you just described a number of these abusive behaviors. Are all of them present in every domestic violence relationship?
Right. No, they're not all present in everyone, and that's why it's very important to do a thorough assessment of a relationship that may be mired in violence to see which ones are present and which ones have a great impact in the relationship, which ones are sort of making the structure of this relationship.
After a sexual assault in an intimate relationship, how might a victim in those circumstances interact with her partner?
So this is one of the myths that people say, well, if she was sexually assaulted by her partner, she would have just left. And nothing could be further from the truth. That's not what happens, especially when it's your husband or your boyfriend or your partner. So what women do is they bury it. They compartmentalize it. They put it away. They avoid it because then they continue to reach out for the kind and the loving man that they got into this relationship with. The problem is that it does fester belief and causes more sort of psychological distress in the victim.
What, if any, role can shame or humiliation play in this coercive dynamic?
So that's one of the emotions that the victim is usually trying to suppress and compartmentalize and avoid and put away. One of the most frequently felt feelings after something so incredibly humiliating and violating is shame. And shame is a very sort of difficult emotion for people to have to live with and to have to experience. And then a lot of times what we see in these relationships, especially ones where sexual assault is perpetrated, there's typically the emotional abuse as well. So now if you're called names like a whore and a slut and easy and fat, and you're feeling the shame from the sexual assault that just happened, it sort of acts as a compounding effect, and it sort of kind of slowly deteriorates the psychological functioning of the victim, and where they're just really trying to get back to the good guy, get the good guy to come back, but they're suffering these symptoms underneath.
What about intimidation? What role does intimidation play in the coercive control dynamic?
Intimidation is one of the huge factors that we see in coercive control. Again, the goal is to get your partner to do what you want them to do. And if you've established that you can use violence and other sexual violence and physical violence, slamming your hand on a table, throwing a glass, breaking a door, throwing anything, causing a fit, yelling and screaming, that can rise the fear level in a victim that she may modify her behavior quicker, and he might not need to use physical violence because he's already established that fear is there.
What, if any, role could writing obscene messages play in being considered intimidating behavior?
Objection leading.
I said, what, if any, Your Honor?
Overruled.
I mean, certainly writing obscene messages to your partner could absolutely be an intimidating behavior.
What, if any, role does emotional abuse or degradation play in the dynamics?
So emotional abuse and degradation, as I stated before, functions to decrease your sense of self-worth. It decreases your sense of agency. It makes you feel bad about yourself. And when you feel bad about yourself, you're less likely to actualize and see options for leaving. You're so sort of mired in this dynamic of abuse that you come sometimes to believe the bad things that the person is telling you about. So, maybe I am not talented and fat and lazy and stupid, and it interferes with that ability to problem solve and figure out, can I get out of this relationship? And sometimes you feel you don't even deserve to get out of the relationship when the abuse is so chronic and so repetitive.
What role does surveillance as a means of control play in that dynamic?
So surveillance...
Objection leading.
I don't think that's leading.
Overruled. Go ahead.
So surveillance functions to let the victim know wherever you are, there I am. So it makes her feel not secure in her movement, feeling that she has to restrict her movement. Her movement is not hers alone. It usually increases hypervigilance. It increases fear. It increases the need for yourself to mark where you've been and what you've done so that you can go back and prove it to your partner, because you know that there is going to be an interrogation later. When this pattern has been established, show receipts, show me your iPhone, where were you, what's your Google location at? Those are some types of surveillance behaviors that puts the victim very much on edge and increases that level of anxiety and trepidation.
What role does possessive jealousy play in these relationships?
So possessive jealousy is a very difficult dynamic in intimate partner violence. It's very common in situations of coercive control. It's rooted in possession, that the gentleman feels that he can possess her and that he can have her whenever he wants. It's a very possessive dynamic. But the accusations, the problem is when you make the accusations, the woman's forced to refute the accusations. So they're continuing in this dynamic where she's trying to prove, I didn't do what you said, this didn't happen. And then unfortunately, sometimes it escalates because the man is not taking the no for an answer, because this is a perseverative obsessive pattern that's very difficult to penetrate, that often these type of conversations lend themselves to physical and sexual violence.
Does this dynamic happen overnight?
No, it doesn't happen overnight. It happens over time. We don't, a woman doesn't get into a relationship with a man who's beating her up and sexually assaulting her and calling her names and doing all that. She gets into the relationships for all the right reasons, just like we all get into relationships for love, for companionship, for kindness, for a future. But then slowly, all of these behaviors start to take form. And I always say it's sort of like sucking the oxygen out of the room, and then before you know it, you're suffocating.
So, and that brings me to my next question. What role do physical abuse and coercive tactics play interspersed with normalcy and positive moments?
Objection compound.
I'll sustain the objection.
Okay. I'll figure this out some way. What role does love and normalcy play in these dynamics you've been describing?
Objection compound.
Overruled.
Thank you.
So love and normalcy are almost always in these relationships. That, when you are in a lull and the violence is not happening, you're back to sort of the loving man that you wanted, the person who you wanted to be with. And when you pair sort of this violent dynamic, physical violence, sexual violence, with love and attachment, it creates a trauma bond. It creates a psychological bond. An emotional dependency is created. So it makes it very difficult for the victim of the abuse to sort of extricate herself from that relationship, and for her to even believe, frankly, that takes a lot of time to even believe that she can and that she should.
And what, if any, role does that dynamic you've described have in the victim thinking they can fix the problem?
So what do we know from the research? The research with working with battered men who come into treatment is that the only person who can change the abuse is the abuser. So no matter what the tactics that the woman uses, she's trying to do all these different things to fix him, to have him not be violent, to have him not be sexually violent, to have him not be obsessively jealous. And all those things don't change his behavior, because it's up to him to change his behavior. And this was played out a million times in the batterers intervention groups that I led. And the men would tell us, it doesn't matter what she does. I don't care. So the problem is that the woman continues to think that she can fix it, and yet she can't. But she's the one who's then rendered sort of helpless and hopeless because everything that she's trying to do is failing.
What is the cycle of violence?
So the cycle of violence is one way to describe this domestic violence pattern. Typically what we see, and the cycle can be different in a variety of relationships, but typically what we see is in the first phase, so sort of multiple 3 to 4 phases. In the first phase, there's a tension building phase. You're sort of starting to feel that apprehension. He may be throwing his papers on the table a little more. He may be slamming the fridge door a little more. He may be mumbling under his mouth a little more. He may grab a glass a little more forcefully than he normally is. And then there's the incident phase. Then there's the blow up, where the violence, the abuse, the screaming, the sexual violence or the physical violence, all that occurs. Then we come to the contrition phase. I'm sorry. I didn't mean it. It wasn't me. I'm not going to do it again. The promises for change. And then we sort of slide into the calm phase where, this isn't going to happen again. I'm back to stable ground. I want to live in this place, this sort of honeymoon place. The problem in the calm phase is we often see the rationalizations and the justifications for the behavior. It's not like typically the man is taking full responsibility for what he did, but it's calm because there's no, violence and no sort of tension at that moment. And then it recurs. And then it recurs. So you're stuck in this vicious cycle of trying to figure out, how can I be with this man who hurts me, and yet I love him so much.
And what, if anything, does the term love bomb mean?
So the love bombing is, it's more of the colloquial term for the younger folks here, but, where you shower someone with affection and love, in this contrition and calm phase where, you're, everything about you is special. You're the best thing in the world. I'm never going to do anything to hurt you again. I would never let anyone hurt you. And it could be sending flowers and buying gifts or going on trips or your favorite restaurants. And that is, a way of where the man is trying to make those amends. And then it gets the woman hooked. So they get hooked on the kindness. They get hooked on the love. They don't get hooked on the abuse. I've never met one woman in the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds that I've evaluated who was not concerned about the violence. They're all concerned about the violence, but they go for the love.
So, in your experience with these dynamics that you've described, does the victim ever yell at her partner?
Absolutely.
Why?
We know from the research that women use verbal and physical acts of aggression in these relationships. That's not uncommon. This has been researched for 5 decades. And a woman may yell at her partner because she's angry. And anger is a very normal emotion to having been abused. She can also be afraid, but they don't have to be mutually exclusive. We can absolutely, as human beings, feel 2 or 3 or 4 different emotions at once. People do often say to me, oh, she would never yell at him if she knew he was going to hit her. And that's not true. That's just patently not true. That's not supported in the research, and that's not supported in my clinical practice. The problem is there's a classic double bind. The violence has been so normalized in the relationship now. She gets hit if she does yell. She gets hit if she doesn't yell. So for women who feel at certain moments that they need to preserve some sense of their autonomy and their independence and stand up for themselves, they will yell and they will fight back, even though the risk of violence is there. So it doesn't mean that she's not afraid and that she's not concerned about the violence. And it doesn't mean she doesn't also use placating and compliance strategies most of the time as well.
Does in the cases that you have and in your experience, does the abuse typically take place in front of others?
No, I mean, this is classically what we talk about behind closed doors. Most of the intimate partner violence, the domestic violence, happens, in the privacy of your own home. So sometimes we see the remnants of it, the after effects, or victims talk to their friends or family about it, but very rarely are you seeing it happen, the actual blow-up phase happen in the middle of witnesses and other people.
What's the term bystander effect mean?
So bystander effect means what happens when people are aware that domestic violence is happening. What happens when they're aware, even if they're not seeing it, that it could be happening. And what happens is we know that it's very difficult for people to stand up and say something. It's very difficult, especially in situations where there's a larger community of folks and the person who perhaps is perpetrating the abuse is the leader of that community. It becomes very difficult to go up against that, to go up against the sort of the head honcho of the community. People are very fearful of losing their jobs. I've seen this time and time again in the cases that I've worked on, either the Boy Scout cases or the clergy abuse cases, all of those type of cases where the USA Gymnastics, where when we go back and we look, we see people knew. But the secretary doesn't want to lose her job. She has kids to feed. The guy who, checks you in, he doesn't want to lose his job because he has a mortgage to pay. So people are quiet and they don't say anything. And then other people are very, it's a very worrisome dynamic. They don't want to put their foot out there if they're wrong, and maybe I didn't see it right, or I don't really know what happened. I certainly am not going to jeopardize my job if I don't really know what happened behind closed doors, even if I see a trashed room or a bruise. And then people still believe it's a family matter. It's between Amber and Johnny. Let them figure it out. I'm not going to get in the middle. So those are dynamics that happen.
What's the objection?
Motion to strike.
What's the objection?
We identified two names in the answer.
Overruled. Next.
Did you finish your answer?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. What about mutual abuse? What is that? What role does that play?
So mutual abuse isn't really a term of art that we use. What we look at is situational couple violence and intimate partner violence. And when we look at situational couple violence, that really does characterize the majority of types of violence and abuse that happens in relationships. That's when a couple gets out of hand. They may push, shove, slap, yell, say some things that they don't want. And it's not that those behaviors are okay, but those are sort of what our larger scale community-based studies say happens in these relationships. That's distinguished from intimate partner violence, what I'm talking to you about, that has this constellation of symptoms and is rooted in the abuse of power and control.
Is there research that addresses this mutual abuse?
Yeah, there's research that addresses what does gender symmetry look like, male and female. Are they the same? And there's certainly, as I said, research that on the lower end types of violent behaviors, push, shove, slap, we may see similar rates between men and women. In psychological aggression, yelling, name calling, putting down, in some of our big community scale studies, we may see similar rates of perpetration in those behaviors. But then there are, other situations where we don't have gender symmetry. And what the research talks about very clearly is you have to examine context. You have to examine the differential of power and control and coercive control in the relationship to make a full determination.
Do women use violence in relationships?
Absolutely. We've known this for 5 decades in our research. We've been studying this since the 70s. And when we look at what happens, women do report their use of violence. The majority of violence that we do see is what we call reactive violence or self-defensive violence, or sometimes violence that's perpetrated independently of an assault, of something that's going on. But mostly that when the partner begins to become violent, then she may become violent and fight back. And that's not an uncommon dynamic, that if somebody is being pushed or shoved or hit, that a person would fight back. That has been established in the research.
And what, if any, effect does that have on changing the power dynamics or the structure?
Well, you have to find out, does it? Does her use of violence change the overarching power structure of coercive control and violence and abuse in this relationship? And you have to examine those variables to see, does it or does it not?
Can men be victims of intimate partner violence?
Absolutely. Certainly, we know that we have to be careful of gendered stereotypes. We can't go in and think, oh, only the woman is the victim, and only the man is the perpetrator. That just does not comport with the research. We know that the research also shows that we can have domestic violence in same-sex relationships. My very first case was a same-sex domestic violence homicide in Brooklyn. So that was in 1998. So I've been examining and treating individuals in a variety of types of violent contexts. So we have to be careful that bias doesn't get in our way when we're evaluating a particular situation in a particular case. That said, we do know that there still are differences. You know, in a heterosexual couple, in a male-female dyad, the research still is clear that there are differences. Men still perpetrate more severe acts of violence. Women are still more likely to be injured. They are much more likely to suffer sexual violence at the hands of their partner. They're more likely to be intimidated, afraid, and they're much more likely to be killed. So we know that those differences exist, but we do examine, you know, in those individual circumstances, knowing that either one could be a perpetrator or a victim.
So how are you able to determine whether a relationship is a situational violence or intimate partner violence?
So I thoroughly examine all of those other variables. I look for the coercive control, who holds the power in the situation, who's able to say no, who makes the decisions, what are the consequences if you don't follow the decisions of your partner, is there sexual violence, is there intimidation and fear, are there statistical factors that are associated with severe and lethal domestic violence. So there's a lot of data that we have in the field that we can use to assess a particular relationship and really find out what's going on.
Does alcohol and substance use cause people to be violent?
No, it certainly doesn't cause people to be violent. We have plenty of people who can be, you know, struggling with substance abuse and addiction, and they're not violent. But when you have a substance abuse and addiction, and you perpetrate domestic violence, it does create a much more disastrous effect. It is a co-occurring variable, and we know that also from the research that the majority of the women will report that when their partner is drinking, the physical violence goes up. So a lot of the times when he's physically violent is when he's been consuming drugs or alcohol. When he's not consuming drugs and alcohol and he's not violent, those other behaviors continue to persist. The coercive control, the surveillance, the obsessive jealousy, the possessiveness, the psychological abuse, those usually persist. But the alcohol can just throw lighter fluid on a flame in a situation of domestic violence.
Is there research that looks at how women cope with the violence and abuse in their relationships?
Yes, there is.
Please tell me about it. What does it say?
So there's been a lot of research to talk about what do women do. That's the question that everyone wants to know. Why doesn't she just leave? And in asking that question, why doesn't she just leave, we actually are able to say, well, let me tell you what she does do. And what the research shows is women do a lot of things in that relationship. So there's sort of three main categories. One are the formal responses, the formal things that she does. Call the police, participate in prosecution of your partner, go see a therapist, go to a shelter, go to a hospital. These are sort of the very formal strategies that women can use. Then there are the informal strategies, and that's talking with your best friend, talking with your mom, talking with your friends, trying to get that emotional support from your social network. But the most common one is these personal strategies, and the personal strategies are really talking with your partner. They're trying to fix the relationship from within the confines of the relationship. You know, trying to get him to go to counseling, try to get him to go to church, try to get him to understand his ways, try to get him to get into AA or sober counseling or harm reduction model to help with his addiction, compliance with his demands, anticipating his demands, all these coping strategies that are sort of, you know, embedded within that intimate relationship.
Let's talk about the calling the police. Is that a common response?
It's not a common response. Many women do not want to call the police on their partners. You know, using criminal justice interventions in crimes of women and children are the least likely to be called into law enforcement. And most of the time when the police are called, it's because a particular incident has got out of hand and she feels unsafe. And the only way that she feels I can get this incident to end and stop is by calling law enforcement.
And if police are called, does the woman typically participate in the prosecution?
I mean, this has been a problem and a difficulty for prosecutors across the country since I've been doing this work. I'm actually frequently called by the prosecutor to testify about a fact pattern because the victim won't come in and testify. So dropping restraining orders, not participating in the prosecution is a very common dynamic in situations of intimate partner violence, domestic violence. And what we know, and what we know from our law enforcement data and colleagues, is that when you get that 911 call, they're very specifically trained to say, that's likely not the first episode. The chances are there have been more severe episodes before you get this call. So you can't go on the scene and think that this is the first episode of violence. And that's why a thorough assessment is supposed to be done when police officers arrive on the scene. So usually that episode that calls the police is just meant to stop that incident in that moment, to get a sense of safety. But most women don't want to participate and go forward with restraining orders.
Why do women in violent relationships stay in the relationship when the man's hurting them?
I mean, they stay for all the reasons we talked about in the cycle of violence. They stay for the loving man. They stay for the man who's kind. They stay for the man they decided to marry and had hope and promises for their future. So there's a lot of sort of love and attachment is why they're connected to their partner. Some people stay because they have economic reasons and they don't have tangible resources to leave. Some people have children in common and they don't want to deprive their children of a father. So some people fear retaliation. If I leave, I'm going to get seriously hurt. And frankly, the statistics bear it out. The most dangerous time for a woman is when she's leaving that relationship. Her likelihood of being killed grows substantially at that moment. So leaving sometimes isn't a best strategy. Staying keeps her safe. So there's usually a multitude of factors of why a woman decides to stay in the relationship. And again, as I said previously, it doesn't mean she's unconcerned about the violence. It's just she hasn't figured out a way out yet.
What, if any, role does emotional attachment and love play in that?
That's probably the biggest one, is that you have this, we talked about that trauma bond that has developed, that psychological attachment to your partner. You don't want to leave him. You've connected with him on so many other levels that giving that up just feels like a threat to your integrity. You're just sort of, and a threat to his, because you're just so intertwined and attached.
What, if any, role does hope and optimism play?
Hope and optimism are really what keeps victims alive in these situations. That's what gets them going from one episode to the next, to get up the next day and maybe he's not going to drink today. Maybe it's going to be on his good side. Maybe he's going to come home and not disappear for 3 days. Continuing to hope that some type of change is coming down the pike.
Now, you mentioned lethality a little earlier. Can you please explain to us what that means?
So lethality means death, means fatality, and we have very well validated instruments and data that looks at what factors happen in a relationship where a woman ends up dead. And we do that through looking retrospectively, saying, here's, this person ended up dead, killed by her partner in a homicide, and let's see what factors were there so that we can work at preventing it. It's very methodologically sound over different case control designs over multiple cities, used by the FBI and law enforcement. So these are a number of factors that tell us that somebody is in a very dangerous situation. So some of the factors are an increase of frequency and severity of the violence, threats to kill, choking behavior, sexual assault, obsessive and possessive jealousy, controlling behavior, the perpetrator's use and abuse of substances, alcohol and substances, the perpetrator's threatening of suicide himself. Right? Those are some of the top factors, and there are more that are very, very dangerous. When we hear that and we hear a woman is in a situation where those are present, then we are moving out of situational couple violence.
What, if any, role does destroying property?
And destroying property, destruction of property, personal property is also one of the risk factors for danger and fatality.
What, if any, role does leaving threatening messages play?
Yep. That's also a risk factor for lethality.
What are the psychological and traumatic effects that such interpersonal violence has on victims?
Objection compound.
Psychological and traumatic effects are kind of interchangeable.
I'll sustain the objection.
What are the psychological effects that such interpersonal violence has on victims?
So these have also been well researched, and they are wide and varied. We see depression and depressive disorders, sometimes with suicidality. We see anxiety and anxiety disorders, a lot of stress. We see post-traumatic stress disorder. We see substance abuse and substance abuse disorders. We see trust difficulties and difficulties in interpersonal relationships. As a result, we see a lot of shame and humiliation. We see anger and rage, a whole sleep disruption, a whole host of difficult psychological consequences having sustained a relationship of intimate partner violence.
What, if any, role does low self-esteem play?
Well, low self-esteem is a very common after effect, and that, when you're embedded in the relationship, it also makes it just very difficult for you to climb your way out.
What is emotional dysregulation?
Emotional dysregulation, so it's a DYS, dysregulation, is when you sort of don't feel that you have control of your emotions. You feel like you're fluctuating, from one to the one to the next. It's not the same as a bipolar disorder. It, can happen in short moments that, it's really because your central nervous system is so out of haywire from being exposed to so many traumatic events that you may feel things deeply and with a short trigger in a very quick time.
In your experience, is there a particular way victims of intimate partner violence remember the violence they endured?
Well, memory for traumatic events is something that has been well researched. Sometimes people have what we call dissociative amnesia, where because of the physical or psychic pain of what they're going through, a portion of the memory either gets blocked or can't get retrieved. Whether it's stored or retrieval, we're not really sure. But most of the times, the memory is really about when you have multiple repeated events of the same type of thing. So if you are abused multiple times and the abuse is very similar, it's very common for the victim to lose discrete details of a particular incident. They may not retain the memory for the complete incident, and that might not be to dissociative amnesia. That just might be to forgetting because you have so many chronic events that have happened to you.
Are there common myths or misperceptions about domestic violence?
There are. I hope I've dispelled some of them here already, but I mean, the myths, certainly are that women are meek, are passive, are, just sitting there and letting the abuse happen, that women don't fight back, that women don't yell back, that they, old ones, that they like the violence, they're not concerned about the violence, that if it was really bad, she really would have left. If it was really bad, she really would have told the police. All of those myths and misconceptions that just don't comport with the research.
Are there also myths about trauma survivors, how trauma survivors present?
Yes, there are. And what we say is, how lay people think someone who suffered a traumatic event is supposed to act. So in the immediate aftermath of a trauma, people think, oh, they should be hysterical and abreacting and emotional all over the place. And that's typically not the first reaction of a trauma survivor. The first reaction is, suppression, emotional numbing, emotional constriction. How do I get through this? Women who are beaten, they get up the next morning, they get their kids dressed, they get them to school, they go to work, they do a presentation in their office, they go on with life. The most normal thing that a person does who's experienced trauma is to get up and try to be normal. They're striving for that all the time. So sometimes if you see somebody who is more emotionally constricted, looks maybe stoic, looks like they're not feeling, it doesn't mean that they're not having internal reactions. We say this in the field of clinical psychology all the time. The inside doesn't match the outside. What you're seeing on the outside may not match what's going on for the person inside, because they have to be so controlled, because the fear is that if I let out a little of this emotion, I'm not going to be able to put the floodgates back on. It's just going to be too overwhelming. And that's true for people who are involved in litigation, and also true for my private patients who are, even though they're coming to me for help, they try very, very cleverly to not want to feel the the difficult emotions of the trauma that they experienced.
And is it also possible that they can look very friendly and smile and laugh and things like that?
Yeah,
Absolutely. Compound.
Sustain.
What, if any, please describe some of the ways that a victim can hide that, as you just testified to.
We call that the appearance of normalcy, the appearance of competency, right? And it doesn't mean that they're not. It doesn't mean that they're not normal and that they're not competent, but it doesn't give you a bird's eye into their inner experience. And that's what we do in the rooms of therapy, where we really help people deal with that they keep to themselves. But yes, someone can be smiling and happy. It doesn't mean that they're not suffering inside.
Is there a single profile that fits all women in domestic violence situations?
No.
Is there a single profile of a man who perpetrates intimate partner violence?
No.
Your Honor, I'm at a point of moving to a new topic area. I don't know what Your Honor wants to do, because I know we switched the lunch route. I'm perfectly happy to keep going, but if this was a good stopping point, we could make that for the break.
All right, let's go ahead and take our afternoon break for 15 minutes, okay? Just do not discuss the case and do not do any outside research, okay? It's a little early. Dr. Hughes, since you are testifying, please do not discuss your testimony, including the attorneys at this point, okay?
Yes.
All right, we'll come back at 3:15 then, okay?
Thank you, Your Honor.